At 10,000 feet above the moon, Apollo 11 astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong switched on their altitude radar to prepare for landing. But this act was to plunge the mission into mortal danger.
1202, stand by. 1202. 1202, 1202, what's that?
Overwhelmed by information from the landing radar, the tiny onboard computer crashed. Instead of giving the crew vital information, it was flashing up a major overload warning.
There's a lot of information going into that very, very tiny computer. And all of a sudden it says, I'm sorry, I can make no sense of this, I'm stopping, I'm shutting down.
On board the lunar module, the astronauts were stunned.
Whatever information we were looking at, whether it was velocity and then movement over the ground, we didn't see those anymore. Instead, it gave us a code, the number of the alarm. It was disturbing, it was distracting. We were looking at it, wondering what it meant.
Perhaps even more disturbingly, no one at Mission Control had any idea what the alarm meant either. In desperation, they turned to 24-year-old backroom computer whiz kid Jack Garman for advice as to whether the mission could continue.
When that alarm occurred, I was probably the only one in the control center that knew what it was. I had no question about it.
By sheer good fortune, Garman had come across this alarm in a training exercise and had scribbled down the correct course of action on a scrap of paper.
My response was within 5 or 6 seconds saying, yeah, that one's okay, as long as it doesn't reoccur.
1202 alarm. It's executive overflow. If it does not occur again, we're fine.
Garman advised that if the alarm was a one-off, the mission could continue. But the problem wasn't about to go away. The landing radar continued to overload the computer.
We have another 1202 alarm. Same alarm, and it appears to come up when we have a 1668 on. Leave it alone and we'll monitor it, okay?
Now, of course, when it happened again, I was a little nervous. We all were. Is it going to start happening real often? And it's going to lose control of itself. It won't be able to command the vehicle. That was a little nerve-wracking.
With the computer plunging the module into chaos, Armstrong decided to override it and take manual control of the vehicle. But by now, the spaceship had veered a long way off course.
Neil was paying attention, really, more than I was. He was looking out the window. We had craters drifting by. There weren't very many identifiable craters. And Neil said, I think we may be a little long.
The module was lost, but that wasn't all. The descent engine's fuel tank was running critically low.
Now the really dicey part of this mission will continue, because we would normally in training have landed by about 10 minutes. We now get to the point where I get a call from my controller that we have now had low level.
Low level?
And we know by experience and by design that we will have 2 minutes of fuel remaining at an average throttle setting of 30%.
With the module still at 500 feet, it was rushing into unknown terrain. The odds did not look good.
We'd never been this close in training. We start a clock running, a stopwatch, in the back room with the controller, and he is now calling off seconds of fuel remaining. My spacecraft communicator says, Flight, we better get pretty quiet now.
Okay, the only call-outs from now on will be forward.
At that point, things really started to get pretty tense because, Armstrong knew that the fuel supply was dwindling. He had to find a safe spot to land, and he looked out the window and saw this crater the size of a football field with these boulders the size of small cars all around it, and that's where the computer was taking him.
With the fuel running out, the astronauts were faced with a dilemma.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward.
The easiest thing to do is to just slow the rate of descent and fly over whatever it is. That takes longer, burns more fuel, and makes fuel quantity at touchdown a little less.
We get a call that we've had 60 seconds. We pass this up to the crew.
It's looking good, down and a half. Gotcha. 6 forward. 60 seconds. 60 seconds.
I seem to recall we were a little over 100 feet. And without trying to disturb Neil's concentration, I was giving him a little body English to get on the ground as soon as you can.
I will look at the descent rate and say, boy, we're really going to have to drop this guy down towards the surface. There, it's going to be close.
And 4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. 30 seconds forward.
We always said in the simulators, if they got to 30 seconds, forget it, scrub and abort. But in that little window, Neil Armstrong could see the lunar surface coming up, and he knew that if he kept going, he would put it down.
I could see the shadow getting bigger and bigger because the sun was behind us, and we were getting closer and closer to the shadow of the lander, and the dust began kicking up.
Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Seeing her then.
Apollo 11 had landed, with barely 15 seconds of fuel to spare.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
The team completed the post-landing checks. Only then could they reflect on what a very close call it had been.
Things are kind of in slow motion. You are in somewhat control of what you're doing, but afterwards, you know, you may faint because you realize how close it was.
I personally felt physically sick, and I was shaking, because after years of work, you don't think of how you're going to prepare yourself for the moment.
Originally, it was determined the crew would go to sleep as soon as they got to the moon, but, I mean, the adrenaline must really be pumping. Nobody's going to go to sleep.
Immediately, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong got into their bulky spacesuits. They prepared to make history. The world waited and waited for Armstrong to appear, but no one emerged from the module. Unbeknown to everyone, the astronauts' moment of triumph was being held up. They couldn't open the hatch.
It was lack of realization how low the pressure really had to be inside, and usually when you open a valve, why, it doesn't really get everything out